despite the presence of UN peacekeepers. There's been more fighting between forces loyal to incumbent President Laurent Gbagbo and those backing opposition leader Alassane Ouattara. The UN's Human Rights Agency says between 20 and 30,000 people have left just one district in Abidjan. The UN says pro-Gbagbo forces have killed at least 300 Ouattara supporters during the 3-month political standoff. New Zealand's Prime Minister says the country is facing a repair bill of around $15 billion after 2 recent earthquakes. Last week's quake in Christchurch killed at least 148 people. Another 50 are still missing. Funerals have now been held for some of the victims. Large parts of the city have been reduced to rubble. Well, the people of Chile have been marking the first anniversary since a massive earthquake there. A year on, thousands of families are still living in temporary shelters. President Sebastián Piñera is facing criticism for the government's response. Mark Orchard reports.
A pre-dawn vigil at the epicenter of the magnitude 8.8 earthquake. The keynote to a national day of mourning for all the victims and their families. In the coastal town of Constitución, bells tolled and the names of the dead were read out.
To be here along with all the other families is incredibly painful, incredible, but you need to know how to stand up.
President Sebastián Piñera has been touring the disaster zone with the message that his government is sparing no expense to rebuild.
As we observe the first anniversary of the catastrophe which struck our country, the reconstruction has been solid, and we have achieved very significant progress and accomplishments.
The country's main highways are nearly back to what they were before the quake. But building new housing for the displaced has been slower. In this camp, residents who lost all their possessions are still waiting for a grant to build a new neighborhood.
We are suffering here. We don't have water for the house. The truth is that there's been a lot of shamelessness here. That's the only way to describe it.
We are all suffering from depression here. This is going nowhere.
Opposition politicians blame the lack of progress on the right-of-centre government's decision to privatize most of the construction work.
The government cannot continue to accept poor workmanship in the service of the public. The methods they have been employing in the Biobío region are absolutely outside the law and public morality.
Piñera concedes that the work is running behind schedule, but his government says it will accelerate the outsourcing of work to private companies. Mark Orchard, AlJazeera.
Finally, the stars were out in all their glory for Hollywood's biggest event of the year, the 83rd Academy Awards. Al Jazeera's very starry Rob Reynolds trod the red carpet to find out who walked away with the Oscars.
And the Oscar goes to The King's Speech, Ian Canning.
The story of a stammering sovereign won Hollywood's top honor Sunday as The King's Speech scored Best Picture. Colin Firth's performance as a king tormented by a speech impediment and self-doubt earned him the Best Actor Oscar. The film world's shining stars and lesser lights strutted down the red carpet in their best tuxedos and most glamorous gowns, despite unusually chilly temperatures that set many bare shoulders shivering. This year's Best Actress award went to Natalie Portman in Black Swan for her compelling portrayal of a ballerina pushed over the edge of madness even as she achieves an artistic triumph.
This is insane, and I truly, sincerely wish that the prize tonight was to get to work with my fellow nominees. I'm so in awe of you.
A gritty boxing film scored an Oscars 1-2 punch as both Melissa Leo and Christian Bale took home Oscars for Best Supporting Actor and Actress in The Fighter. The warmest applause of the night was showered on Portman. She fell in love with the choreographer on the set of Black Swan, and they're expecting a baby boy this spring. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Hollywood.
Coming up in the next half hour, we're expecting to hear from the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who is going to address the media in Geneva after her comments to the UN Human Rights Council meeting. All that and the rest of the day's news coming up. We've got the headlines next. Reminder of the top stories here on Al Jazeera. Libyans are fleeing parts of the country still held by the leader Muammar Gaddafi. More protests are being reported in the capital, Tripoli. According to the Reuters news agency, security forces fired into the air to disperse the crowds. The country is facing international pressure, with the European Union agreeing on a number of sanctions. Egypt's Prosecutor General has imposed a travel ban on former President Hosni Mubarak and his family, pending further investigations. He's also ordered a freeze on all financial assets inside the country. Mubarak's the most high-profile and most senior official of the previous regime to have a travel ban imposed on him. Yemen's opposition has rejected an offer to join a unity government with the president. An opposition coalition of political groups and anti-government protesters want President Ali Abdullah Saleh to step down. Tens of thousands of people have been protesting against his leadership. An Iraqi court has sentenced a former British security officer to 20 years in jail for killing 2 contractors. Danny Fitzsimmons is the first Westerner to be convicted by an Iraqi court since the invasion of 2003. He was found guilty of murdering 2 of his colleagues in 2009. The 30-year-old said he shot the men in self-defense. Palestinian security officials say Israeli forces killed a fighter and wounded 2 others near its border with Israel. Medical officials say the man was killed in an airstrike. The Islamic Jihad group says the dead man was a member of their organization. An Israeli military spokeswoman has denied launching any airstrike. Police in the U.S. state of Wisconsin say they won't force labor rights protesters to leave the state capitol building. Hundreds of protesters defied an order to vacate as police locked on. They've been demonstrating against the state government's plan to strip public sector employees of their collective bargaining rights. And South Korea has defended its right to carry out joint military drills with the US amid protests from North Korea. The major annual land, sea and air exercises are held every year, and commanders insist they're purely defensive. But North Korea has threatened to turn its neighbour into a, quote, sea of fire following the drills. This comes as talks between the 2 Koreas aimed at easing tensions broke down recently. Those are the headlines. The news continues after Counting the Cost, coming up next.
Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, Libya. From international pariah to partner and back again, we look at that country's role in the global economy as oil prices continue to rise. We're at the London School of Economics, where Gaddafi's son once studied and submitted a 400-page report on civil society and human rights. And as the unrest spreads, governments struggle to get their people out. We look at Turkey's relationship with Libya. Well, the world has been doing business with Libya for years, but now as Gaddafi's regime allegedly bombs its own people, was the West right to pour billions of dollars into the oil-rich country? The price of oil is steadily rising as the unrest there continues, hitting stock markets and consumer spending hard. In a speech to Kuwait's parliament, UK Prime Minister David Cameron said countries like Britain were wrong to support oppressive regimes for the sake of stability.
For decades, some have argued that stability required highly controlling regimes and that reform and openness would put stability at risk. So the argument went, countries like Britain faced a choice between our interests and our values. And to be honest, we should acknowledge that sometimes we have made such calculations in the past. But I say that is a false choice. As recent events have confirmed, denying people their basic rights does not preserve stability. In fact, it does the reverse.
In 2008, Italy agreed to pay $5 billion to its former colony Libya in reparations, and that opened the door to numerous deals. And now Berlusconi's attempts to befriend Gaddafi and his regime could be backfiring. And as Banu Batnaga reports, Italy isn't the only country caught up with investments in Libya.
What does the Juventus Football Club, Italy's biggest bank, and the country's biggest oil company have in common? All have a Libyan connection. After the oil-rich country renounced weapons of mass destruction in 2003, it's been the darling of the West, managing to secure multi-billion-dollar deals, make investments right around the world, even secure the early release of the convicted Lockerbie bomber. Now, from Washington to London to Rome, it all seems a bit premature, and Libya's former colonial overlord Italy stands to lose the most. The Libyan Foreign Investment Fund owns 7.5% of Juventus, one of the world's most successful football teams. Libya is the largest shareholder in Italy's biggest bank, UniCredit. The Libyan central bank governor is also UniCredit's vice president. Then there's the Italian oil company Eni, which has been drilling in Libya since 1959, longer than Gaddafi has been in power. Italy relies on Libya for a quarter of its crude oil. And 2% of Italy's biggest defense and security firm, Finmeccanica, is also owned by Libya. Italy's Silvio Berlusconi and Muammar Gaddafi signed a 2008 friendship treaty in which their two countries promised billions of dollars in mutual investments and a promise from Gaddafi to curb illegal immigration. Since then, Libyan and Italian interests have become more entrenched, and now at a time of uncertainty in Libya, concern is mounting in many boardrooms. But Italy isn't alone. Gaddafi's overtures with the outside world stretch far beyond the Mediterranean. Take a look at this list of all the known companies and the countries where they're based with significant oil deals in Libya. They all stand much to lose as the situation there deteriorates.
I assure you that American oil companies and British as well as Italian are involved in Libya, and they signed contracts in the last 2 years.
Relations with the UK improved back in 2004. As then Prime Minister Tony Blair shook hands with Gaddafi, Anglo-Dutch oil giant Shell signed a multi-million-dollar gas exploration deal off the Libyan coast. Fast forward a few years and British defence companies were allowed to sell projectile launchers and crowd control ammunition to Libya. Now though, facing scrutiny over the possibility British weapons could be used against the Libyan people, the government has cancelled at least 8 arms export licences. And while the US has been critical of Britain cozying up to Gaddafi's regime, Washington has allowed firms to quietly conduct business as usual. In 2007, US firm Occidental signed a deal to spend $5 billion over 5 years developing oil production.
The ex-Prime Minister of Britain, Mr. Blair, visited Gaddafi 3 or 4 years ago, and they reached an understanding. After which we heard that the Libyan who was imprisoned in Scotland has been released. Of course, the Americans didn't like that, and consequently they thought that the release of the Libyan prisoner was due to an understanding about granting British companies some more concessions, oil concessions in Libya. That's why the focus of attention was on Britain. But remember that the Americans are up to their neck in their involvement in Libya.
Libya's wealth and Gaddafi's family have become irreversibly entangled in the global economy. What happens in that country and to the regime will have reverberations right across the world. Banu Bhatnagar for Counting the Cost.
Well, joining me now from Rome is Maurizio Caprara, diplomatic correspondent for the Italian daily Corriere della Sera. Maurizio, thanks for being with us. Have the chickens come home to roost here for Italy? Is it paying the price for years of getting friendly with a regime that many people say is now showing its true colors?
Obviously, relationships are a problem now with Libya in this moment, and Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi signed in 2008 in Benghazi a friendship treaty with Muammar al-Gaddafi that joined efforts, Italian efforts and Libyan efforts for developing a lot of activities. And the decision was that Italy has to give $5 billion in 20 years for infrastructures and social activities and so on in Libya. And now, obviously, there is a great problem at this moment.
And what about the personal relationship between Berlusconi and Gaddafi? They're both leaders who, some would say, have an eccentric side to their personalities. But how is that personal relationship between the two of them? What kind of a role has that played in cementing some of these deals?
The relationships improved